changing security dynamics in the Nordics. We're joined here with three speakers. Let me shortly introduce them to you. We have Peter Viggo Jakobson, who is a part-time professor at the Danish Center for War Studies. He has many publications on his name on Danish defense and foreign policy, its position in NATO, and on grey zone conflicts. Then we also have Gunilla Herlof, a senior research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. She focuses on European integration, European security policy cooperation. And besides that, she's also chair to the Research Council of Holland Vet Institute. In advance, I'm already apologizing if I'm saying the names wrong, but I suppose that's obligatory at this point. Then we also have Hanna Ojanen from the Tampere University, where she is a research director. She focuses on European integration, on foreign security and defense policy, and last but not least, she's also a president of Eurodefense Finland. Might not come as a surprise to you, but all of our speakers are also very well versed in matters of security in the Nordics. Lastly, my name is Bart Brouwers. I'm the secretary to Eurodefense Netherlands, and I'm the chair to the Eurodefense outreach program, as a part of which we try to discuss matters of European security for a wider audience. I have the pleasure of hosting this discussion. While I'm by no means an expert in the topic of this discussion, I will try my best at moderating it. We expect the webinar to take about an hour. We ask you to mute your microphones and to ask your questions in the chat, and I will read them out to the participants. Now, just to kick off the discussion, while the war is raging in Ukraine, the European security architecture that seemed fundamental some years ago has changed in more ways than one. Some very profound changes are happening there, as Sweden and Finland are exchanging their post-World War II neutrality for NATO membership. And as you all know, we have run into some unexpected problems due to Turkish obstructions towards that membership. I'm sure our speakers will devote a few words on that. On the other side of the Baltic Ocean, Denmark has voted in a referendum to scrap the EU defense opt-out, opening the way to the growing number of EU security programs. Now, I would like to ask Mr. Jakobsen to tell us a bit more about what's happening in Denmark. Peter Viggo, over to you.
Thank you. Could you make me co-host? Then I'll use some slides.
That is up to the Eurodefense France account. I'm sure they can do that.
then I'll see if they can fix it.
We're dealing with communitarian resources here, so it's all decentralized.
I hope you can see my slides.
Perfectly well.
Yes, I'm supposed to tell you about what's happening in Denmark. And yes, it's correct that we got rid of the defense opt-out. But other than that, nothing much happens. So I guess it's great that I'm going first, because then we can get to the more exciting presentations afterwards. But from a Danish perspective, everything is looking great. It's of course not great for Ukraine, but if you look at it from a Copenhagen Danish perspective, then security is actually looking quite good. I mean, the US is back in Europe supporting the alliance. Germany has figured out that it actually has to start investing in defense. Finland and Sweden are now de facto members of NATO, and Russia is less of a threat than it was before it attacked the Ukraine. So basically, from our perspective, reassuring the Russians are probably a greater challenge in the Nordic region than deterrence, because if we add it all up, then deterrence from a NATO's perspective is actually looking quite good. Let's see if I can remember how to change slides here. If we look at the US, the argument I'm making that the US is now back. Well, the US has basically moved closer to Europe and become more integrated in European defense since 2014. And that trend was not discontinued under Trump. The US is back in Iceland, where it has reopened the Keflavik Air Base. It has negotiated a base agreement with Norway that gives greater leeway with respect to using bases in Norway than it was allowed to during the Cold War. And Denmark is about to negotiate a similar base agreement with the US. And I suspect that it's going to be very similar to the one that was negotiated. I think there's someone that should mute his microphone. And if we look at the actual military presence in the Nordic Baltic region, we see increased US military presence and exercises in the Barents Sea. We see it in the Norwegian Sea, and we also see it in the Baltic Sea. If we look at what's happening in Germany, you're all aware that Germany has now decided to spend 100 billion euro on arms. It's increased its defense spending to 2%, and once the reforms that has now been announced have been rolled out, Germany will have 3 divisions on the Eastern Front. Arguably, that will be enough to deter the Russians all by itself. It's true, we hear that Turkey is opposed to letting Sweden and Finland into the alliance, but I see that as a matter of time before Finland and Sweden is let in. I cannot imagine for 1 second that the US will allow Turkey to prevent this from happening. We have already seen the United States and the UK pledge to support both countries militarily in the unlikely event of a Russian attack. And you're probably aware that Copenhagen also was quick to announce military support to the Swedes in the event of a Russian attack. Not quite sure what we would have sent, because we have nothing left to send, but at least it was a nice show of moral support, at least. But essentially, once the Finns and Sweden has taken the last step into the alliance, they have been de facto member of the alliance for a long time, then I have a very hard time seeing any Russian surface ship or even submarines survive for very long in the Baltic Sea in the event of a shooting war. It will be completely impossible for the Russians to get anything from St. Petersburg out into the Baltic Sea, and the Kaliningrad base is very much surrounded by NATO countries. So I think that the Russians are going to find it very hard to do anything other than just basically defend themselves if we were to get into a military confrontation with them in the future. If we look at what's happening in the Ukraine, Russia has probably lost more than 20,000 personnel by now. They lost a lot of equipment. They're losing. They're running short on sophisticated missiles. And once this war is over, one way or the other, I simply cannot see Russia being able to rebuild its military force or even modernize it. Simply because it's going to be short of funds. It's also going to be short of spare parts from the West. So unless China thinks it's a good idea that Russia get back to its former military might, that's not going to happen. And it's certainly also hard to see the Russia being able to actually threaten NATO and going to war with them in the foreseeable future. That was already a distant prospect before the war, and now it's become even more distant. So if you look at it sort of from the Nordic perspective, I would say that things are actually looking quite good. NATO deterrence is working. NATO has not been attacked by Russia. Instead, Russia opted to attack a country that wanted to become a NATO member, and that's probably also one of the reasons why Russia decided to act before the Ukraine was led into either the EU or NATO. We've seen Russian military capacity be reduced, and it's being reduced as we speak. And at the same time, we see steps being taken at the summit in Madrid to increase NATO's reaction force to 300,000 personnel. And they're probably also taking steps to increase the military presence along the Russian border, along the borders with Russia. So from that perspective, NATO deterrence is actually increasing. So from my perspective, the key sort of challenge from the Nordic perspective is to avoid increasing tension with the Russians in the Baltic Sea. And here I think that both Sweden and Finland would be well advised to adopt a no nukes in peacetime policy, and also to avoid receiving large numbers of troops in peacetime. I don't see any value in doing that anyway, since Finland is more than capable of deterring Russia by themselves, considering the large army that they have, and I simply find it difficult to see what Russia would gain from using force against its Baltic neighbors. If we look at the Danish policy, the assumption in 2014 was that Russia would not attack Denmark or NATO. The primary end of Danish military strategy was to maintain the US security guarantee, but without spending 2%. And if we look at the way we went about this, and I guess you're all aware that burden sharing in NATO these days is measured by the 3 C's: cash, capabilities, and commitment. And if you look at the way Denmark went about this, they were low on cash, they were low on capability, but high on commitment, meaning that whenever we got a phone call from the US, NATO, the French, or the alliance, we would make troop contributions. We have also done this after the Russian attack on Ukraine. Basically, everything we have has now been sent to the Baltics. So we were trying to maintain a good standing in NATO by sending troops whenever the phone rang, but we did not want to spend money, and we had very few capabilities. If we look at what's happening in Denmark since the Russian attack, the threat assessment is still the same. Denmark does still not regard a Russian attack on Denmark or NATO as likely, and we do still not want to spend 2% on defense. It's true that we recently had a new agreement made by a majority in parliament that Denmark would now increase its spending to 2%. But as you're probably aware, we're not going to 2% until 2033. And it's not a typing error. And the reason I put it this way is because I had a conversation with Stoltenberg recently, the Norwegian Prime Minister, and he told me that when he had got the news that Denmark was going to 2%, he thought it was a typing error. He thought that the Danish government meant next year and not in 10 years' time. And I think that's probably typical of the Allied reaction to the Danish announcement that we would also go to 2%. But not for another 13 years. And I think that tells you a lot about the threat assessment that we are having currently in Denmark. Now, as was mentioned, we have removed our defense opt-out. That means we can participate in the EU Defense Agency, and it also means that we can participate in EU-led military operations, but we don't have any troops. They are all doing NATO duty, so if we got a call from the EU tomorrow, nothing would happen. Everything is sent with NATO in the Baltic. So we have absolutely nothing left. So we really haven't reacted much to the Russian attack. And I think that what is driving Danish policy is not fear of Russia, but fear of getting left behind by the German decision to spend 2%. Denmark has up until now pegged its defense spending to Germany, the Netherlands, and Norway. but they're moving closer to 2% at a much faster rate than Denmark is, which basically means that Denmark has been left behind on the platform while the train is leaving the station. And that the concern that's creating in Denmark is that we're not going to be regarded as a member in NATO of good standing. And I think that that's a primary concern driving Danish politicians. It's not fear of the Russians, because they're not afraid of the Russians at all. So it has more to do with self-understanding and identity than it has to do with the Russian threat. What does this mean in terms for Nordic cooperation? Yes, since Denmark does still not want to spend on defense, and since our capabilities are very low, Denmark bought, just to give you an example, Denmark has bought 22 F-35s that we will have available in Denmark. Finland just bought 64. And that sort of goes to show the difference between the two countries. We have no military capacity whatsoever with respect to increasing our military cooperation with our Nordic neighbors. We'll continue to focus on NATO, and will prioritize military cooperation with Germany as their new forces come available, and will focus our cooperation with the US. I think that Denmark will, there's no doubt that Denmark will do everything we can to facilitate the Swedish and Finnish entry into NATO, but we cannot really do anything in terms of practical military cooperation other than sharing information and intelligence. So to end it off, the Danish policy right now is completely out of sync with what's happening in Madrid. NATO is going to establish a 300,000 strong rapid reaction force. And if it's going to be based at the same level of readiness at the current rapid reaction force, that means that these troops should be available for operations in 30 days. Denmark is currently trying to build a brigade, and that's on a 180 days readiness. I mean, it's completely out of sync with what's happening in the alliance. And will be hard pushed to continue to provide greater contributions of troops to an enhanced NATO presence in the Baltic. So I expect that we're in for a really tough time during the summit, where we'll be told by the Americans to get our act together and speed up our spending. Whether the Danish government and the parties in parliament will bow to that pressure remains to be seen. But that's the space I'm watching right now. Whether Denmark will be pushed by its partners to spend more on defense much faster than they had initially intended. And that's all for me. I'll hand it back to the next presenter.
Thank you, Peter Viggo. I think that that will give us plenty of stuff to ask questions on later on. So let's go over to Sweden now with Gunilla Herlof. Gunilla? You're muted, I'm afraid.
Here we go. Thank you so much, Peter Viggo. This was highly interesting, and surely have some comments. We are not as optimistic in Sweden, but not dramatically scared either, I would say. Actually, I will start in another corner. I will start with the Swedish development, and I'm so happy about my conversation with Bart recently, because he really gave me the right enthusiasm for bringing up this topic, and this is about Swedish non-alignment. When Bart said, "You are one of the real believers in ideology, right?" And I said, no, we are not. It's very well known that Sweden has been non-aligned, sometimes called having a neutrality policy, for more than 200 years. It is much less known that this has never been ideological, not in the 1800s and not later on either. And it has always been very clearly expressed also by Swedish politicians that this is a policy to avoid war. Since Sweden has not been forced into non-alignment by any other country or organization, it has the freedom of changing it the way they want, and they have. When needed or preferred, Sweden has taken another path. And I will not mention all the examples of this. I can say that in 1997, together with Finland, I will not speak about Finland very much, Hanna, but this is interesting. In 1997, the Finnish and Swedish foreign ministers in a joint statement declared that they had no intention of joining NATO at that time, but they said non-alignment should not be seen as a given. It is only a means to avoid war, said Tarja Halonen and Lena Hjelm-Wallén, the two foreign ministers. And that's how it was. The most important step that Sweden took to leave non-alignment came in 2009 with a Swedish unilateral declaration of solidarity, stating that Sweden will not remain passive if another EU member state or Nordic country suffers a disaster or an attack. We expect, they said, these countries to take similar action if Sweden is affected, and Sweden must therefore be able to both give and receive civil and military support. Of course, this had a relation to the simultaneous parallel discussions within the European Union. This was Sweden's way of saying we are also a country of solidarity. And also, as I've heard, it was an expression of their view that there is no place for neutrality in a war in Europe anymore in 2009. If anything happens to one country, it will unavoidably happen to another one as well. War will spread. It can never be contained to one country. So this was very much connected to the discussions within the EU, as I said. But then in 2014, the development became even faster because then came the Russian factor. And 2014, I would argue, had a great impact on all the Nordic countries. Denmark became more interested in Nordic cooperation. Sweden and Finland started very intensive, close bilateral cooperation. And we also got closer to NATO through the Enhanced Opportunities Partnership, EOP. And all the Nordic countries came closer together. And now we changed the subjects of our cooperation. Now cooperation between all of us was on territorial defense. Before that, it had been on research and development of certain weapons, things like that. But now it was territorial defense. And it was also expressed very well by Sweden in its host nation support of 2016, which for Sweden was very much related to the fact that NATO needs access to Swedish territory in order to help the Baltic countries. This is in many ways the greatest Swedish asset, its territory. NATO needs Swedish territory. Still, it is, I must admit, also a huge step for a country to take to join NATO after having been non-aligned for 200 years. And I think it's a greater step for those who have not followed Swedish policy, which goes for a large part of the population. They know we are non-aligned, but they don't follow the new events happening all the time of closeness to NATO, of the solidarity declaration and so on. About NATO, yes, of course, we hope we will be able to join, and we hope we will be able to join fairly soon too, but this is no given. Some of the demands put by Turkey are simply impossible to fulfill. Sweden can turn itself backwards and inwards, but there are things that are absolutely not possible if we are to stick to our values. We can compromise on certain things, but not on everything. So what will be the changes for Sweden when we join? First of all, Article 5, that can't be denied. To know that NATO will help us if attacked is a huge difference to where we have been when we have hoped for a NATO response, but never being sure. It's a relief for us, and we believe that it also will lead to increased deterrence against Russia to attack us. It will be a change for the Swedish military, who have focused on the Swedish territory in their planning. Now they will work together with others and work with discussing plans for the whole alliance. It's quite a difference. And it's also an advantage for Sweden now to be present at an early stage in the planning, not like we are now when we hear about the plans when they are already discussed by others. And finally, it's also a possibility to influence when discussing. Another focus will be on the Nordic region. Always when you speak to officers in the Nordic countries, you hear their expression that the Nordic region is for them one operational area, not 4 countries. Now this one operational area can be used at the utmost, which it couldn't be before. And to mention only Sweden, it will lead to increased efficiency because of the pre-planning that we know about now. Finally, we will also be part of the new tasks. We will surely be part of the air policing and enhanced forward presence, first of the Baltic countries, Iceland, of course, as well, but maybe elsewhere as well, because I think it would be useful for Sweden to show that it contributes to NATO as a whole, not only for our neighborhood. I think that is always important to show that you are not too stuck in your own geographical area. So what will be the changes for the Nordic area? Well, most probably we will become together more influential within NATO when it comes to Nordic issues. Anything else would be a bit strange. The interesting issue is, will we also acquire some strength when we are here, 5 Nordic NATO countries together? That depends on us, I would say, and whether we have any particular issues that we want to bring up and that we can bring up in a convincing way. NATO protection also is sometimes more extensive geographically than we perceive of. And I think there are 2 good examples that concern Sweden. For example, Gothenburg is the most important harbor for Sweden. And it means something when this harbor is protected by NATO. But then we must consider that Gothenburg is also the most important harbor for Norway. So even Norway as a NATO member will get some added help from that. And in addition, it's also a very important harbor for Finland, even if it's not the most important one. Gotland is, of course, a name that you hear all the time when speaking about the Baltic Sea and Sweden. Very, very sensitive. The one who is dominating Gotland is dominating the Baltic Sea, it's said. But Gotland is not only important for Sweden, and the Baltic Sea as such, it's also tremendously important for the 3 Baltic countries. So they are very happy about this if things go well. And the Danish opt-outs, I would say that is a very good addition to what we are already doing in the other EU countries. It's another capable country that will come into the EU, and seen from a Swedish perspective, it's also a country that, like Sweden, is very transatlantic minded, if you can divide countries in that way, which we often do. Finally, very briefly, what are the changes for NATO? First, I think both Sweden and Finland, but I won't speak about Finland, I promise again. Our territory is highly strategic. As I said, Sweden is very useful for coming to help of the Baltic ones. Joint planning for the Nordic area will be very useful for NATO as well. And finally, we bring high technology defense forces that are since long interoperable with NATO. And that's where I end. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting words, Gunilla. Hanna, over to you.
Thank you, Bart. Really very nice to be able to listen to Peter and Gunilla. And I'll try to add something from the Finnish perspective here and to be rather short. Today has been one of those very, very interesting days and surprising days. I was trying to see whether something already comes out from Madrid. We were waiting for news to come, whether there is some kind of a declaration which Turkey signed already. I don't know. There has been so much discussion today about whether one should be optimistic and hopeful or perhaps not. And we are still waiting, I guess. And this is all about one of the big surprises of the process towards NATO membership that was caused by Turkish opposition that was unforeseen. The Finnish political leadership had been very careful to consult with everyone in advance to be sure that the process would be really smooth and quick. And then we are where we are now, waiting and expecting something to happen. But anyway, the spring has been in so many different ways really unforeseen. And in Finland, a lot has happened really fast, something that researchers will need to analyze for quite some time, I think. So how to describe the change in Finnish thinking? I think, as you all can imagine, Finnish defense policy has always been about Russia. Russia used to be the reason for thinking about NATO membership, but also the reason for not applying for it. Until then, one day, it all changed. The Russian aggression on Ukraine at the end of February, that was when everything seemed really clear. There had to be a major reaction from the Finnish side. And the public opinion, as you certainly know, it shifted really dramatically in favor of NATO more and more. The latest poll from yesterday is that 70% are for and 10% are against. So soon we will be over 100% for, so to say. But when it comes to the debate and discussion in Finland, one new element is that the political leaders are now prepared to act directly against Russia's demands about NATO enlargement. And it has been really interesting to follow the arguments for membership and how they have evolved. Particularly when we think that in foreign and security policy, continuity is really often seen as a value. So how does one ensure continuity when so much is changing? And one way is to use certain key concepts in a new manner. In the Finnish case, I think that freedom of movement has been such example. Earlier on, we had the so-called NATO option that provided this freedom. Finland could, if it so wanted, apply for membership. It was free to move between membership and non-alignment. Now, this had to be rephrased. Now it is that if Finland did not join NATO, it would have less freedom of movement in the future. In other words, Finland's room for maneuver is now better protected within the alliance than outside. And the Finnish government also makes this very explicit in its latest report on the security situation. It also says that now failing to react to the changes in the security environment could lead to a narrowing of Finland's room for maneuver. So failure to react would be bad, and reacting, that means now applying for NATO membership. What is interesting and what also relates to Sweden is that NATO membership is foreseen to have many positive consequences in the north and for Nordic cooperation, something that is obviously reassuring and very interesting listening to what Peter just said. When thinking of what this could mean in practice, I think of the Swedish-Finnish bilateral cooperation that is indeed quite deep and that could be of inspiration to other countries in NATO. Another question is whether there will be this kind of Nordic NATO or Nord NATO of some kind, whether that would increase regionalism or sub-regionalism within NATO and what the consequences would be. And then the big question that Gunilla already was approaching about whether Finland and Sweden would actually have some influence inside NATO and whether they would try to have some. When they joined the EU, they were perhaps in a similar situation. They faced some doubts from among the old member states. Their neutral past seemed to cast a doubt, as it were, on their willingness to follow the new common foreign and security policy. So they wanted to show that they are really eager to take part in the developments of crisis management, for instance, and be very active and constructive. Whether this applies to NATO, we'll see. How will the two, perhaps, for instance, approach the questions about defense planning? That is an interesting question. But these will re-emerge, I'd say, once the process of membership and the signing of the accession protocols are done, and once the two are actually members, if it takes still a while. And it will also be interesting to see how all this may or may not impact Sweden's and Finland's views on defense cooperation in the EU, whether they'll have the energy to continue working on that as well. And finally, one of the consequences of the enlargements of both NATO to Sweden and Finland and of the CSDP to Denmark, so to say, I think they might both be signals of increased vigor of both NATO and the EU. And this might have a consequence for the several different bi- and multilateral defense and security agreements that have been on offer for the past years, the European Intervention Initiative and so on. Perhaps they'll be a bit less needed if their goal has been to reinvigorate defense cooperation when the big organizations were not that able to move. Now the two seem fully capable of moving ahead and renewing themselves. So perhaps the institutions get their positions strengthened. And traditionally, at least, Finland has been a country that very much relies on institutions and sees, for instance, the Commission as a support for smaller member states. So there are, I think, many open questions, but I would leave at this and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna. if it's all right with you all, I would like to start off with a question of my own. A few days ago, in the Financial Times, the Prime Minister of Estonia mentioned that her country would be wiped off the map in case of a Russian invasion and in the face of existing NATO plans. Now, what do these changing security strategies, what effect does it have on the defensibility of the Baltic states? What changes for them? Who would like to have a go at this question? If there's no volunteers.
No, I can go. No problem. I mean,
Right.
it'll of course take some time to get both Finland and Sweden integrated, but it's not unlikely to expect the US also wanting to make similar agreements with Finland and Sweden as they have with now both Denmark and Norway, and that would be agreements giving the US access to bases in both countries. That would of course make it much easier for the US to provide rapid air support for various military operations in the event of a Russian attack on the Baltics. As was also mentioned by Gunilla, it's going to make pre-planning and operations and intelligence sharing much easier once you have both Sweden and Finland into the alliance. So it's going to make the defense of the Baltic much easier. If you then add to that the fact that NATO is now starting a process of building a 300,000 strong force that will be available at short notice with pre-positioning of weapons, equipments, and what have you, that's going to make deterrence feasible, and it's going to move us away from the current tripwire posture to a posture that's more going to look like the deterrence of denial. So if I was sitting in the Baltics, I would be very pleased with current developments.
Well, thank you for the good news, Viggo. Gunilla, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I agree. I think they are very pleased because they will have what I mentioned before, the possibility of reinforcement coming over Sweden. Sweden would certainly say no, would say yes if asked, but now they know in advance that they can do it. And I think that there are two other things. One thing is that I believe the Baltics will insist on a heavily defended Gotland because Gotland is so central. And another thing, it's totally of a different character. Putin has proven very true to his own promises. When he has said, I plan to do this and that, we are planning to do an attack on this and that country, he's usually done it. This is what those who are specialists on Russia often refer to. And he has mentioned that he wants to come back to the old Russian Empire again. And the Baltic countries are certainly part of it. And in his ways of teasing Sweden, he's also said that one of our policies against Sweden will be to go for the Baltic countries, which were part of Sweden in those days when Sweden fought Russia. So there is no way for the Baltic countries to feel safe, even though they are members of NATO, because they are so difficult to protect, unfortunately.
Right, that's a good lead up to the next question from Eurodefense France, who would like to ask Peter Viggo if he's not a bit too optimistic on the probability that Russia won't attack the Baltic states. Peter Viggo, could you specify that a bit?
Yeah, but what's he going to attack with? I mean, even if they end up succeeding in the Ukraine, it's probably going to take another couple of months at least of really intense fighting, because at the moment things are looking a bit up for Russia after a disastrous start and their retreat from what you could call the battle for Kiev. Now they're gaining ground a bit and slowly, meticulously in the Donbas region. But there can be no doubt that once Ukraine has received the equipment that it's now getting, long-range missile systems, more heavy equipment, they'll try to take some of this land back. There's no way that Zelensky can just say, oh, that's too bad, we'll just have to sue for peace now, before he has tried his best and demonstrated to his own public that he cannot take Donbas and Crimea back. And in that fight, Russia is going to lose more personnel and more equipment. And given the fact that sanctions are going to remain in place for a long time, I simply cannot see Russia reconstitute the offensive capabilities that it had before. And it's now, due to what NATO is instituting, in 10 years' time, Russia is not going to have any advantage whatsoever in terms of mobilization or anything else if the various countries meet their NATO commitments. Of course, Germany is key here. I spoke to a Finnish high-ranking officer not too long ago who said that his greatest concern was a weak Germany. And I would agree with that assessment. But if Germany actually does what it has said it wants to do, spends 2% and build 3 divisions and place them on the Eastern Front, I cannot see Russia wanting to or even trying to attack the Baltic countries. So I do not share these fairly pessimistic assessments that once he's done in the Ukraine, he's going to make a go for the Baltic countries. I simply cannot see Russia having the capability to do that.
I definitely see your point. However, you mentioned the US is back in Europe, renewed commitment. You also mentioned that even in Trump years, this commitment did not waver in Danish eyes. However, it is undisputable that the US will shift to the Pacific. Everyone agrees on this. How are the 3 countries here, how are they preparing for this eventuality, for this certainty even?
Well, if I can start again, Denmark is not really preparing in the sense that we're still not spending any money, but we have allowed that the US special assess to our airfields and harbors, something we did not do during the Cold War. So we are basically compensating for our military weakness by letting the Americans in. And the way I see, what I think the US will take away from this war is that if the US can provide air support, can provide intelligence and basically enable the Europeans to hold the ground, then I think that what the US will simply tell its European allies is that you're going to be the Ukrainians now. You will have to fight the Russians if they come on the ground. Then we'll supply the intelligence, we'll supply the target data, but you do the fighting. So the way I see the pivot to Asia materializing is now that the US will basically make sure that it can provide all these things to European forces, but then the European forces will have to do the fight, as you're seeing the Ukrainians do right now. So in that sense, that will enable the US to keep the Europeans on a tight leash politically and also militarily, and still enable them to move more forces to Asia. And I would also expect the compromise coming out of Madrid from the summit being that if the US is going to continue to support Europe with deterring the Russians, then they want something in return in Asia. So even if it's not going to be mentioned in the strategic concept, it's going to be the tacit agreement that's going to keep the alliance together.
All right. Well, in terms of great geopolitical schemes, we have a question from Romain Lefebvre, who asks, what are the true intentions of Turkey behind the reason currently invoked to block the process to join NATO? What deal can Turkey expect? Hanna and Gunilla, I think you're best positioned to answer these questions.
Thank you. I can start, not that I know what the real intentions and goals are, but this is something that has been very intensely debated in Finland. And today, for instance, from the morning till the very end of the day, trying to figure out what it could be. And different answers have been provided, having to do with prestige to start with, or then concrete political concessions and steps taken by Finland and Sweden. There might be something to the arguments of prestige, like a way for NATO to show that Turkey is an important country, somehow making Turkey seem important enough. How that can be done? There seemed to be this declaration in the making about the case of Sweden and Finland in particular, but then also a special discussion on the southern security concerns in NATO and particularly terrorism. So if something very general but still somehow helpful emerges, that might be sufficient for Turkey in those terms.
Very similar in Sweden too. We are guessing. We believe it may be for internal consumption in Turkey, to be able to show prestige, as Hanna was talking to, for his countrymen. It can also be related to Syria. It could also be related to the major power, to the United States, to the reaction of buying the Russian air defense S-400, not being allowed to buy F-35, now wanting to have the new version of F-16, if I'm right, again. And many other things, no, not many, but a few other things are mentioned. And it doesn't seem that any one of those who are inside well, the normally well-informed group is really sure what it is.
Right, thank you. We're getting a follow-up question from Mark Edsik. He says, in case Turkey will not get what they want, it seems that they could say yes for Finland and no to Sweden. Do you think that Finland will join without Sweden? Hanna, what do you say?
I think our president just said no. And the reason appears that that Finland would in that case be the very lonely on the front line, so to say. But I would also add that we are actually not in a hurry, really, not as it perhaps appeared to be earlier on this year. As it is very important that Finland and Sweden are on the same side, like both in NATO, in order to be able to continue their cooperation, we should really proceed together.
I can add that we are very happy if Finland waits for us, as always, this spring, because we were late in developing our minds. But also, I don't think that NATO would be too happy with having first a discussion with Finland, where they don't know if Sweden will be part of the discussions later or not. And then a discussion with Sweden, because the two are so much interrelated. So it would be an incredibly difficult discussion with both of these countries, and in particular with Finland, because then you have all the possible options left. So I think NATO would be happy if this would not take place. But it's interesting, I had a chat in a Swedish newspaper, and among all the questions I got, there were a lot of people who said, let Finland go first. We are so hopeless and they are so quick, so why not let them go first? So that seemed to be a very common view.
Okay, well, that's quite sobering. Let me see. Guy Lindstrom has asked on Gotland. The Gotland has been mentioned, but what do you think about the islands in the Baltic security context? They're very strategically located, but they are formally demilitarized.
Sorry, I think we are talking about two islands here. Åland, or should Guy speak about this in his question? Or was it a question?
It was a question.
It was a question, okay.
Yes.
Åland is completely demilitarized. Gotland is not. So they are very different. Åland has a very special system, which is organized by the United Nations, or the League of Nations, rather, I should say, and the people living on Åland are extremely reluctant to let go of their status as neutral, they say, and demilitarized. Gotland was unfortunately demilitarized for a few years until the Swedes realized that this was a very bad decision. This was during the years when there was a perception that things will continue to go in the right direction. Now there is plenty of military people in Gotland, and the most interesting issue for me is whether NATO will have its own interests in Gotland and tell them to Sweden, or how this will go about, because I think particularly the Baltic countries would be interested in that.
Right.
If that was what Guy Lidström meant, I'm not sure.
I'm not entirely sure either, but I'm probably goes a long way, and otherwise we'll hear from him. Now, all of these developments, the memberships, etc. Do you expect that the interests of your countries will diminish, augment, or stay the same towards the common security and defense policy of the European Union? Peter Vigo, perhaps you'd like to.
Sure, I can do that. I mean, but again, I mean, to be quite frank, the EU is not really a military player. It has about 5,000 personnel deployed on various tiny missions that usually do not involve any fighting. So in that sense, it's basically a small peacekeeping force. And if you compare it to the UN, which has typically between 80,000 and 100,000 personnel deployed, it's a tiny player. So in that sense, I don't really think that it's going to make much of a difference from the Danish perspective. I think we'll continue to look mainly to the major players in Europe. And if we are talking the southern front or the southern flank, that typically means France. And there is a reason why France came up with the European Intervention Initiative. That's because the EU can never agree on doing whatever the French wants done in Africa. So they set up the European Intervention Initiative, and Denmark has contributed to French-led operations in that format. And since Germany is not really interested in the southern flank at all, and certainly do not want to field forces in Africa, but will now prioritize building up a force on the Eastern Front, I don't think that the French and the Germans will see eye to eye on this. So I actually predict that we're going to see a continuation of current deployment patterns. So I expect Denmark to continue to provide support for French-led operations and only to make tiny contributions to EU-led operations. But again, the primary constraint in Denmark is simply lack of forces, lack of capability. We have a very hollow force, we are overstretched, and we simply do not have any soldiers left. So if we were to increase our contributions to the EU, we would have to reduce our commitments to NATO operations. And I do not see that as very likely in the foreseeable future because of the focus on increasing NATO presence in the Baltic. So I think we'll prioritize NATO over the EU and only make token commitments like a couple of staff officers or what have you.
Gunilla, please.
I think that Sweden will try to contribute to both EU and NATO, but be very reluctant to contribute to EU if that in any way is done at the expense of NATO. Sweden has always been an Atlanticist country, thinking that you should not complement EU with those assets that you can already be given free from NATO. And I'm sure this kind of thinking will go on.
I think for Finland's thinking, Finland has been really a country favoring a strong role for the EU in security and defense. And it might change slightly because of the new importance of NATO, at least for some time. But it also very much depends on what happens actually, what happens with crisis management overall. Will it diminish because of the increased stress on territorial defense? And sort of increased lack also of enthusiasm for operations abroad. That might be a change. And then also the EU's role, somehow it is growing when it comes to territorial defense even. It is hard to see how NATO might be doing military mobility, for instance, without being in cooperation with the EU. But these are sort of long-term changes, rather.
Right, thank you. If you don't mind, one last question of my own. All three of your countries are part of the Arctic Council. How will these developments affect the Arctic region? Will this lead to a greater securitization of this region?
Well, so far it hasn't. And again, if I'm right that the events in Ukraine is going to slow down modernization of the Russian forces, that's going to have a major impact on the northern fleet. That is Russia's most potent naval force, and Russia had large plans for modernizing its nuclear capabilities up there. And I think they're going to have a hard time actually doing this modernization plan now. So I think it's also going to mean that Russia will have less military capability in the high north than it otherwise would. Now, if you look at it in the longer term, my prediction is that this is the situation unfolding in the Ukraine is going to make Russia economically weak and entirely dependent upon China. And that means that we might easily get into a situation, if I'm right, in 15, 20 years' time, when Russia is so weak that it cannot deny China military bases in the Arctic. Now, if that were to happen, then that is definitely going to lead to securitization. But I don't see Russia being a greater military threat in the high north because of the events in the Ukraine. So far, we have not seen a spillover from the Ukraine to the high north. I think that developments in the high north very much will depend on what NATO decides to do and the NATO countries, because they have decided they do not want to cooperate diplomatically with Russia in the Arctic Council. So basically, it's the ball is in the US court, so to speak. It's going to depend very much on how the US is going to see its relations with Russia in the foreseeable future. It's important for Norway to continue to cooperate with Russia in the Barents Sea, and Denmark also needs to cooperate with the Russians because we have to negotiate our territorial claims with the Russia over the North Pole. So we also need to establish a decent working bilateral relationship with the Russians. So I think we'll also do what we can to see if we can get diplomatic cooperation going in the High North again.
Gunilla, go ahead. Your microphone is off.
Sorry. Largely, I agree with Peter Viggo. One thing only, if an issue is really important for Russia, I do believe that they would deal with it. I mean, they have a population that is not like the populations of other countries that will not suffer small reductions in their buying power, things like that. Russians, if they have the right propaganda served by the authorities, which they usually have, Putin is very high up in popularity, can be convinced that they have to endure some suffering because of what is happening in the world, and they will be able to use the resources they have if the Arctic is really what they perceive as the most important. As I've seen it now, the Arctic Council has been a fairly harmonious unit, but that is because everyone has decided to keep it like that. But there are a lot of issues up in the north that are really important, not least the Russian military investments there, and they may cause Russia to act in a way that will be rather forceful. That's all.
Just adding a very minor point, if I may, speaking about the Arctic Council makes me think of all these sub-regional organizations that were established in the 90s, Arctic Council and the Barents and the Baltic Sea Council, that had as one key element the fact that they were places where cooperation with Russia could institutionally take place, that were sort of low-key pragmatic organizations. Now their activities are suspended, and the big question is whether they will be continued at some point or not, and what the forms for cooperation with Russia will be in the future. So there is also that side to the discussion.
Right, thank you. We promised we'd keep it to about an hour. It's already getting a bit later for our Finnish friends that are joining us here. Unless you have any final remarks that you might want to share with us, something that maybe you wish had come up but didn't come up, please feel free to throw in a few last lines. If not, then that's perfectly fine as well. And I would just say thank you very much for a very interesting webinar. We have recorded this webinar. We're gonna share it on the Eurodefense YouTube channel, and also Julia Hutting, who is here, my colleague from the Netherlands. She's gonna write a summary of about 1 to 2 pages that you will all see on the Eurodefense website. So thank you all. And from the Netherlands, I'd say have a very nice evening.
You too. Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Good to
Very
hear.
interesting. Thank you.